There was a time where I was quite happy to exclusively wreak havoc in the dusty recesses of Australia's brutal future, depicted wonderfully in 2015's Mad Max. I hadn't really been particularly interested in learning more about Max's two-wheel toting Pacific Northwest cousin, Deacon St. John, and I will admit I viewed the horde mechanic with a certain level of skepticism. I felt generally uninterested about the concept as a whole, and like many others believed to be a victim of what is now being coined as post-apocalypse fatigue. An opinion that appears to be rife among the gaming community is that both Days Gone and Mad Max are criminally underrated. While this description has undergone such ferocious use over the last decade it's at risk of losing all meaning, I will at least sympathise with the sentiment. Quality might be divisive among critics and players, but something that we can surely universally agree on is that both games share some significant similarities. And so, 18 months after the launch of Days Gone, and the post-apocalypse fatigue seemed to lift, giving way to both temptation and curiosity. Since then, I have bounced back and forth between each title more times than I can count. And this ultimately drove me to ask the question, what is it about both games that I find so enticing? There is certainly no shortage of dystopian settings depicted in games. So why do I find myself all too often splitting my time between a broken Down Under and a land of the free but fallen? Given the mere premise of this video, you'd be forgiven if you think I intend on pitting both games against each other and concluding that one is superior. But that is not the plan. You are welcome to reach and share your own conclusions down below, in fact I invite that, but I won't be at any point announcing a clear victor. Mad Max and Days Gone both offer an expansive sandbox, one more literal than the other, whereby their respective lead protagonists, Max and Deacon St. John, attempt to overcome immeasurable odds in order to reach their goal. Max to build his magnum opus and Deacon to be reunited with his wife.
Wanted a freak show.
With regards to Days Gone, the early stages of the game present itself as more of a tale of two buddies surviving a broken world. But this quickly evolves into searching for breadcrumbs in order to track down Deacon's possibly still living spouse. Naturally, we are introduced to a number of different side characters that each have their own complications and vices, causing Deacon to hit the brakes on his ultimate goal and serve as a glorified errand boy. If we turn our attention to Mad Max, our titular character seldom wavers in his prerogative throughout the entire game's runtime. Almost each and every single line of dialogue uttered by Max is fueled by his ambition to ostensibly acquire a V8 engine and build an ultimate driving machine. Now 99 times out of 100 I would argue that placing a one-dimensional character as a lead protagonist in any medium is a recipe for disaster. But Max only shares one dimension for the vast majority of the game. He is entirely fixated on getting what he wants, to the point where he can be downright cold. To see this from a lead character is not only refreshing, but it's executed extremely well. Something I found to be apparent when looking at both games' narratives in isolation is that Mad Max's simplicity ends up being an enormous advantage. The twists and turns that Days Gone implements are frequent, but rarely are they surprising. Just as a final warning, major plot points are about to be revealed. We learn early on that Deacon's wife, Sarah, worked in a lab as a government researcher prior to the world being overrun by a viral pandemic. It's likely just by virtue of that one sentence, we could join some dots.
What is it?
Now this might not set off alarm bells in the real world, but when a narrative is constructed, it's important for specifics to have meaning. The writing in Days Gone pulls no punches when informing us of Sarah's profession. This just emphasises that her career is of large importance. When we later have it confirmed that the work she was performing in the lab was in direct correlation with the outbreak, it's presented to us as some sort of enormous twist. Meanwhile, as the player, if we had been paying even the slightest amount of attention, we likely figured this out a dozen or so hours ago. Predictability aside, the reveal only serves as a way of presenting Deacon as someone incapable of putting two and two together. Unfortunately, the writing falters on more than one occasion, often with varying results. Another standout moment though is providing such a severe lack of context it robs the scene of any meaningful impact. Suffice it to say, Mad Max doesn't fall victim to these same writing pitfalls. As previously mentioned, there is a simplicity in the game's narrative, quite possibly encouraged by the no-nonsense gameplay. The main body of the game's narrative sees Max completing various objectives in order to reach his charge in Gastown, the distant smoking behemoth visible from virtually anywhere on the map. The complexities and morals of multi-dimensional characters are absent, and the world has become harsh and violent far beyond even what most post-apocalypse games provide. Kind hearts and generosity are non-existent, everything is done for something. Max knows this all too well and will complete errands for almost anyone as long as it gets them closer to his goal. That said, the ever-present vice that rears its head and disrupts Max's ambition is the glimpse, the sliver of human compassion that he still possesses, all directed towards the concubine Hope and her daughter Glory. The conflict that Max undergoes in moments like this are some of the only moments in the game where we get a clearer insight into Max's psyche. These moments are rare, they are brief, but they are also touching. Largely because they are fleeting instances where Max isn't tearing his way through blood and fire. Unfortunately, the scarcity of these scenes make it so that the connection built between Max, Hope and Glory is never fully expanded upon. They can very often feel shoehorned in after we've been blasting our way through all manner of mayhem. But that mayhem is where the magic happens. Claiming that Mad Max nails vehicular combat would be a disservice. Each collision feels like shrapnel blasting through the screen into your home, the impact shaking the building to its core, and billowing fire and smoke consuming whatever remains. Making our way to an objective only to be distracted by a couple of wayward warboys is part of the whole Mad Max experience, and each encounter shows off the game's pandemonium perfectly. The outstanding vehicular combat is something that I would expect from a Mad Max game, and it's clear to say it doesn't fall short. You would maybe then also assume that the hand-to-hand combat would underdeliver. You'd be wrong. Max may as well have asteroids for fists, because the weight behind each swing feels like it could shatter moons. The hand-to-hand encounters take on a dialed-down and weightier version of the free-flow combat system popularised in the Arkham series. The familiarity makes it easy to learn and easier still to master. There are very few occasions where the player is challenged when it comes to taking on enemies face to face. Perhaps this is a slight downside, but the worst that comes from short fights is expediency to the next brutal encounter, whether that takes the form of flesh and broken bone, or metal and burning rubber. And this is all put in front of what is frankly a gorgeous backdrop. It's undeniable that despite its muted colour palette, dictated by sand and more dirt and more sand, the varying shades of beige, brown and orange are balanced expertly with near impeccable art direction. There was clearly a lot of room for character designers to flex their ideas with all manner of intricacies and deformities congruent to the already well-established Mad Max lore. 8 years after the initial release though, and it just so happens that those character models are probably the area that has suffered the most with age. But it would be unfair for me to penalise the game for merely making do with the technology that was available at the time. 4 years after Mad Max's release, and with what I suspect to be a significantly larger budget, Days Gone boasts at times outstanding visual fidelity, with character models being among some of the highest calibre of its generation, and still easily going toe-to-toe with some of the heavy hitters even in 2024. Of course, there is the added benefit of a PC and current gen port. But measuring the beauty of each and every pixel and polygon is all irrelevant unless they are constructed in a manner that is interesting to explore. The rusted dust bowl that makes up post-apocalypse Australia is one of the most unique open worlds I've ever had the privilege of exploring. I'm very confident that a lot of people would have dismissed the opportunity of venturing into the game given its potential for repetitive scenery. After all, what diversity can be accomplished with sand and rock. What might be surprising to learn is that not only is the map interesting to explore, but each individual region comes with its own distinct look and feel. Worthy of recognition is that these separate regions don't feel out of place either. Travelling from the Reek Hills to the dunes is a gradual transition from one area to the next, and it all feels impressively organic. It comes with a heavy heart that I can't say that the same level of excellence can be attributed to Days Gone. The world sure looks great from a technical standpoint, from the dense forest surrounding Copeland's camp to the snow-dusted logs at Booker Hicks. And of course the level of location diversity presents a wonderfully varied colour palette. But what I've found to be a weakness is a severe lack of genuinely interesting landmarks to explore. A benefit that comes from creating a world with a fallen civilization is the flexibility to design and implement any number of world-building environments. Why did this happen? How did this get here? What events took place? These are the sorts of questions that I'd like to ask in a dystopian setting. Days Gone doesn't really develop this concept half as well as it could, leaving the world just a little bland with regards to exploration. But there is something that makes up for the slightly uninspired world. What is possibly the most impressive part of Days Gone's whole presentation is its ability to maintain the excellent visual fidelity while simultaneously rendering hundreds of vicious, flesh-hungry creatures during the game's horde sequences. I will put it bluntly, these scenes are excellent. No matter how many times I face off against a slew of rabid freakers, I still feel my whole body tense up as they inch closer to overwhelming me. Their biggest drawback is that they are almost exclusively left for the closing hours of the game. A frankly bizarre choice given that the horde mechanic is the larger of the game's two primary USPs, and is without a doubt what drew the vast majority of players to the game in the first place. Aside from the occasional horde sequence, the main body of the on-foot gameplay is balanced between repetitive cover-based shooter mechanics and fairly weak melee encounters. These aspects are largely serviceable, but only really function as a means of offering gameplay variety. Where Days Gone is at its best is when we are knowingly putting Deacon in mortal danger for the sake of survival. Quietly negotiating wreckage-laden terrain into an area that is almost certainly filled with creatures keen on tearing us limb from limb is a great way of building tension. Add the panic of spooking a horde and only just escaping by the skin of your teeth is something that very few games out there are able to replicate. What makes the escape all the more satisfying is tied closely to the game's second USP, its dedication to motorbikes being the sole form of transportation. It's never really expanded upon as to why this is the case, but we can suspend disbelief and accept that it's a matter of fuel efficiency, as well as offering the ability to easily circumvent blocked off areas that would most likely be impassable by car. Suspension of disbelief can only get you so far though. The concept quickly becomes illogical when you consider how exposed motorcyclists are with no barrier between the infected and the rider. Factor in the volume of a motorbike's engine when silence is paramount to survival, and the motorbike's only gameplay mechanic makes about as much sense as Deacon shouting at the top of his lungs in response to a radio broadcast for no apparent reason.
Radio Free Oregon. Don't believe the lies.
Great, Cope! So, you and your granddaddy set traps for him, and you and your old man used to lay down salt licks. That's real sporting. Guess none of that shit matters now.
Logical or illogical aspects aside though, I can't deny that Deacon's bike feels great. It's responsive while simultaneously carrying enough weight so that it feels heavy to maneuver. There's a decent amount of customization to make it stand out from the other bikes, and it gives you the impression that you're moving quickly while also not asking you to have the reaction speeds of a Formula 1 driver. Now let's shift gears and take a look at Mad Max again. It's obvious that there's a vast difference in customizable vehicle real estate when simply comparing Max's car to Deacon's bike, and with the core narrative focus being trained on Max building his magnum opus, customization is tied directly to nearly every objective in the game. By the midpoint of Max's story, there'll be 101 different ways of making Max's gas-guzzling war machine distinct and tailored to your exact specifications. From border spikes to hood ornaments, from suspension to of course the engine that can scream like a creature being dragged to hell. I've done a lot of talking by this stage, so what I'll do is shut up for a moment and just let you appreciate some of the audio from both games.
Fix this. That should do it.
Get out there and fix it.
My black fingers itch for sacred work.
I mentioned at the start that elevating one game above the other wouldn't be my intention, but instead sharing the experience that both games offer and highlighting some of their similarities. I'm only human though, and it's probably quite obvious that I have a greater degree of allegiance towards one particular title. Regardless, I hope that it's clear that I carry a certain level of respect for both games and wholeheartedly wish that they would each receive their sequels. Unfortunately, it's long been understood that any dreams of a Days Gone 2 have been dashed. The relatively poor reception during the game's unstable launch makes it very difficult to justify financing a follow-up project. It may sound harsh, but I can't say I'm overly surprised. Days Gone is what I consider a mediocre experience, elevated by some interesting ideas. The team at Bend Studios are probably seen to be better off taking some of their lessons learned and applying it to a new IP. I can, however, say I'm honestly excited to see what they come up with next. The fate of a second Mad Max game, however, still hangs in the balance. At the time of writing this, Furiosa is releasing within a matter of months, and this has injected a breath of hope into the lungs of those screaming for a Mad Max 2. But with Warner Brothers owning the rights, it's safe to say that that breath of hope has a slight bitter aftertaste. So what is it about these games that keep dragging me back to their fallen civilizations? They both have their fair share of merits, partnered with their fair share of imperfections. But contrary to popular belief, they also present experiences that are seldom found among the gaming industry. I'm not talking about the unique dystopian setting or the adrenaline-fueled horde encounters. Now, the aspect that's rarely portrayed in games is even more obvious. Max's magnum opus and Deacon's bike are virtually extensions of themselves. We will spend the vast majority of our time navigating Australia and Oregon respectively, with either 2 or 4 wheels beneath us. Both vehicles see Max and Deacon through thick and thin, and despite some design missteps, something that is held to a damn near perfect standard is the marriage between man and machine.